So here's a little pre-story to the law. At the time of Joseph, the family of Israel was about 70 people. But after 430 years, there were about 600,000 men, plus women and children, which means they were now about 2 to 3 million people. In this, we see God was keeping His promise to multiply and make Abraham's family into a great nation. However, the Egyptians became afraid of their large numbers and enslaved the Israelites. So the Israelites cried out to their God. And God raised up a man named Moses. He was actually born an Israelite, but through a very interesting story, he was raised by Egyptian royalty. One day Moses saw an Egyptian beating an Israelite slave, and he made the mistake of defending the slave by murdering the Egyptian. So Moses flees from Egypt and goes to the land of Midian. Here Moses becomes a shepherd of sheep, which is ironic because soon he'll become the shepherd of God's people. One day Moses saw a miraculous burning bush that didn't burn up. It's from here that God spoke to Moses. He said He's heard the cries of His people and told Moses to go back to Egypt to set His people free, and He said that He would be with him every step of the way. So Moses returns to Egypt and gives Pharaoh God's command to let the Israelites go. Now Pharaoh was a hard man, and he refused God and kept the Israelites as slaves. This is where God showed His power by using the 10 plagues, some miraculous attacks against Pharaoh for keeping his people as slaves. It was crazy, but it's through this that Pharaoh finally released God's people. God used these miracles to reveal His good character and power to the Israelites. He was showing them mighty things like He's above other gods, He's in control of nature, He provides for their needs, He protects them, He cares for His people, and He hears their cries for help. Now these are all very important things they would need to know and remember as they stepped out and followed God out of Egypt and into the desert. So Pharaoh finally releases the Israelites, and Moses leads them out of Egypt. God continued to be with them and show His miracles. He had pillars of cloud and fire to lead them in the desert both day and night. And He provided food and water for all these 2 to 3 million people in the middle of a desert. And don't forget the incredible part where God parted the Red Sea so that His people could walk across on dry ground. God was using all these things to show the people of Israel He's not just another God. He is the God. He's beyond compare and without equal. It's here that God made a covenant with the people of Israel. When you read about the law that God gives the people, this is God saying, I will be your God, and you will be my special people. God said to them, You saw what I did to the Egyptians, and how I carried you out of Egypt and brought you to myself. Now if you obey and keep my covenant, you'll be my treasure out of all the peoples. The whole earth is mine, but you will be for me a priestly kingdom and a holy nation. Wow, God really wanted to bless and love the Israelites. Part of this covenant is what is known as the 10 Commandments. God was setting the Israelites apart from all other nations. If they chose to follow and obey Him, like Abraham had done, then He would be their faithful God and care for them. Now you might be asking why God needed to give them the law. Well, the law was a good, right, healthy way for His people to live with Him and each other. The surrounding nations had horrible worship practices, creating unhealthy communities full of murder and chaos. Their beliefs led to abusive immorality and even sacrifice of their children. You might say the surrounding nations ended up being like lawless pirates. So, of course, God didn't want His special people living life like this. He wanted them to live healthy, good lives with Him. When God gave the law, He was demonstrating 2 main purposes. Number 1, God is holy. He is set apart and different than all the other nations' gods. Number 2, if God is holy, then His people must be holy and set apart like Him. They shouldn't live like all the surrounding nations. Let me illustrate this by telling you the story of a friend of mine. She grew up in a large family of 10 kids, and she said when her mom would go to the grocery store to shop, she would take all of them with her. Now, usually, we'd imagine all kinds of chaos with that many kids in a store with one parent. But this mother had taught her children to all walk behind her calmly and quietly as she shopped. Other people who saw this were surprised by the children's good behavior and would come up to their mother and say things like, "You're so amazing. Your children are amazing. You're a wonderful mother." The people had seen the goodness of the children, and it reflected the amazingness of their mother. In a similar way, when God's people are living holy and good lives, like God, it points others to know what an incredible, amazing God there is, and that they can come to know Him too, and be His special people. Here's the 10 Commandments you'll read about. The first few have to do with relationship with God, and the last have to do with relationship with each other. Laws always reflect the heart of the lawgiver. You can see by the laws that God wanted healthy, good lives for His people. The law could be summed up with 2 thoughts. God's people should love Him and love other people. But I hear you. You're asking about the priests and sacrifices, right? Where do they come in? What do they mean? So there were 3 parts to the law. I call them directions and rules for right relationship between God and man: the tabernacle, the priest, and sacrifice. The tabernacle was like a large tent, and it was where God's presence came down from the heavens and lived in the middle of all His people. Now this was quite amazing because it was the first time God had lived with His people since the fall of mankind with Adam and Eve. The priesthood. Now these were specifically chosen men to serve in the tabernacle. They were from the tribe of the Levites. Remember, God was holy and righteous, and sin made a separation between God and mankind. So the priests were like mediators, working between God and the people, so that people could get rid of their sin and be able to be holy and righteous and in right relationship with God. And the sacrifice system. Sin causes death, so how can people be brought back to life with God? Now in those times, livestock equaled livelihood, which means animals were like money. People often bartered or traded for food, clothing, and other things. In the sacrificial system, if there had been a sin, then it must be paid for by a sacrifice. So let me illustrate with this simple story. Let's say I was an Israelite girl, and I stole something. Now stealing was against God's law. The law said I must find a sheep without blemish or flaw. Not any sheep would do. It must be a perfect one. Then I must go to the tabernacle and to the priesthood, and he would offer the sheep as a sacrifice to pay for my wrongdoing. The sin I had committed was breaking God's good law and choosing not to follow Him in His ways. Once the sacrifice was offered, I was forgiven and made right with God again. But imagine I went home and my father asked me what had happened to his sheep that was missing. And I shrugged my shoulders and said I didn't know. Oh, now I just lied, and God's law had said not to tell a lie, but to be truthful and honest. So now I must find another sheep and repeat the same process. Not just any sheep, but a perfect one. Not this one. Nope, he won't do. Okay, this is a good one. Do you see what's happening? Slowly, these valuable sheep are disappearing. Now imagine it wasn't just me, but I had 6 brothers and sisters, and all of us needed the sheep. Suddenly, that's a huge problem. Now, that's my simple illustration, but you're getting the bigger picture. God was teaching that sin is costly, and they couldn't afford to pay the price. Not just in sheep, but sin brings death and brokenness, pain, and more. Sin affects our relationship with God, our relationship with others, our own personal well-being, and our family and society. This was such a huge, important thing for them to learn. So there's one last piece of the law covenant. In this covenant agreement between God and His people, man's part was to obey the law, and if they broke it, then to offer sacrifices for their sins. God's agreement was to forgive His people and to bless them as they obeyed. Now we're talking a lot about covenants, but they aren't weird. In fact, we have covenants today too, like when we make a business contract, or marriage vows, or even when we buy a car. We're making a promise agreement that both sides will uphold. And just like there's consequences if we don't pay for the car, or if we break our other agreements, so there were for the people of Israel too, if they broke their covenant promise with God. These were something called the blessings and curses of the covenant. So the people agreed to follow and obey God. In return, His blessings to them were things like prosperity. For instance, a blessing was that their crops would grow and prosper, and they would have plenty to eat. However, if they broke God's laws and turned against Him, the curse would be poverty, like the failure of their crops. Another blessing He gave was victory over their enemies. However, if they turned against God, they lost this protection, which brought the curse of defeat by their enemies. Another blessing was their health, but again, sin brings destruction. If they turned against God and lost His protection and care, then they were subject to sickness and disease. And lastly, remember that promise God made to Abraham to give his descendants the promised land? The blessing was the possession of the promised land, but if the people turned against God, they would lose it instead. Now guess what? These curses were actually a part of God's great mercy for His people. How? Well, the curses were meant to be a warning to the people. When the people weren't listening to God, then the curses were a circumstance that shouted to them, "Come back to God. His way is life and blessing for you." The whole point of God's law covenant was to bless and love His people. That they understood that true life came from Him, and not following Him would only lead to sin's ongoing death and destruction in their lives. One last thought here. Remember how I said we could follow God's promise of restoration through the whole Bible? We can see it in the law and the sacrificial system, because sin is costly and we can't afford to pay the price. So it was meant to point towards the promise of restoration, to show the need for a Savior. Just like the Israelites could never have enough sheep, no amount of doing more, sacrificing more, or trying to be more holy will ever be enough on our own. We will need the help of a Savior. So what can we take away from today? The law had a purpose of peace, life, health, freedom, and restoration. We all have some sort of authority and influence in our lives, don't we? Yeah, we certainly do. Just like the law, we should use our authority and influence, not selfishly, but to bring good, like God's laws do for us. Let's feed our thoughts by the law. What are some things in your life that make you feel God has been restrictive? What are some of His rules or commands that you haven't wanted to obey? Look again and consider that God's heart by His rules and commands, they are to bless you, grow you, and love you. When God gives a no to something you want, He's actually granting you a yes for the better things He has for you. His no's cancel the death sin brings to your life in order to bring you life and goodness. Okay, let's place these things under the story step of the law. The Israelites were enslaved in Egypt and cried out to God. God raised up Moses to help deliver them by miraculous events. God showed His people His love and care by making a covenant with them called the law. This includes the Ten Commandments. There were 3 parts of the law: the tabernacle, where God's presence lived with His people; the priesthood, the chosen men to serve in the tabernacle as mediators between a holy God and His people; and the sacrificial system, where God's people could be forgiven of sins and made right with Him. As the people followed and obeyed God, they were His special people, covered by many blessings. However, if they chose to turn against Him, curses came as a warning so that they would return to right relationship with God. The law could be summed up in that the people were to love God and love others. The perfect ingredients for a good life with God and all the people around us. And big news! By this point, you will have finished the books of Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And you've also completed the section of the Bible known as the Books of the Law. A huge accomplishment, so way to go! In our next video, the Kingdom of Israel emerges, but not without some drama.